I'm going to start with the opening brachas for all of us. Just have the bracha in mind. I'm having you all in mind. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah. V'arevna Adonai Eloheinu divrei Toratcha b'finu u'b'fi amcha beit Yisrael v'niyeh anachnu v'tzeitzeinu v'tzeitzeim amcha beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratav lishma. Baruch atah Adonai lemei Torah l'mo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'chabanu mikol hamim v'natan lanu Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
All right, morning, guys. Listen, Kevin brought up an interesting point. He sent me a reference point that it says the dowry to the value of a batula for a girl that does not give, that gets seduced, and that a rape is 50 shekels. And he was saying that for a seduction, from his note, it appears it's a dowry to the value of a batula. I just want to clear this up. If you go to the Schottenstein, Kevin, on B3b on note 28, it says one who rapes or seduces a young unmarried girl. It's in Ketubot 40b. Who is a virgin must pay a fine of 50 shekels. It says or. It does specify both. So kindly check that.
Because it's a Schottenstein Chumash, so it's actually quite weird that it wouldn't say that it's an Art Scroll Schottenstein Chumash. That's quite mad. But
if you look at Kesubot 40b, it states there that it's for either or. Your particular case, you need to check it out. If you're accurate, I'm more than happy to add that amendment. The same thing as yesterday, I realized that I made a mistake. I sent on the group, Bava Kamma group, that Tameh and Tuma can be both, can be plural, but the one is an adjective and the other one is a noun. Okay, and I sent that correction because we have to be pretty accurate, and I'm English speaking. So that was there, if you guys have a look at it. All right, so now that we've picked and been petty, let's go to the specifics. Any questions before we get started and get this done?
Yeah, just a quick one, because it actually it kind of ricochets off last night. Sure. Sorry, I know the other guys weren't present. How come there's such a light sentence for rape?
It's not a light sentence. It's a whole discussion on its own. Gav, I can always phone you and discuss it because
I remember some of the complexity of rape. You have to marry the girl, all that type of stuff. But okay, we'll talk about it some other time. But it's something I think it maybe needs to be discussed at some point. All right, it's fine. Thank you.
With pleasure. All right. So it's still the whole week we've been on B3, 4B3. We're still on ball 3, 4B3. It's not a ball. That was a Freudian slip.
Okay. That's not boring either.
Not at all. Okay, so we discussed yesterday in summary, one who contaminates somebody's produce with tumah. So whether that person was a Kohen or not a Kohen, if your produce has tumah, no Jew can consume it. The example it uses in the Gemara is something very specific, is that the teruma that belongs to a Kohen is touched with the carcass of a sheretz. There's 8 types of sheretzes, and this causes a loss. For teruma that is tameh may no longer be eaten by a Kohen. And the problem there is that only a Kohen can eat teruma. It's not for the rest of the Jewish people. So that's rendered a worst case of damage, because obviously no one can eat it. But just generally, if food or drink becomes tameh and is induced with tumah, whichever you use, the noun or the adjective, it's not fit for Jewish consumption. So the same loss would be achieved. He who mixes teruma in somebody's ordinary produce, I just want to explain that to you guys, is that only a Kohen, as we said, can have teruma. So if that's an ordinary produce, it's got to be sold to the Kohanim. Because it's not in an open market, you can't get your buying price. If many, many people want what you have to offer, it obviously renders a higher price than if a very small niche market has for what to offer, and you're stuck with it. It's different with a niche market, as I said, with Apple computers or something that's very, very high profile with people with a lot of money. This is a case where you've kind of boxed yourself in a segment of people that haven't got affordability because they're supported by the Jewish people, the Levium, as you knew. So the teruma that's going to be bought by a Kohen is going to have a set low price. Okay? And one who renders somebody's wine with nesech, we haven't discussed that, so I just want to discuss what that is. Nesech was basically a part of a libation when you poured for idol worship. And obviously, anything to do with an idol worship practice, no Jew can get benefit from it. Does that make sense? And that is in Avodah Zorah 29b. So, any questions on the last one? Okay, so a question that should come up, which is actually Gittin 52b to 53a and brought by Rashi, is that how come such a person doesn't get the death penalty? Because it's idol worship. So the fact of it is they do get the death penalty, the person that's doing it. But sometimes they've used certain objects within the practice, or they attempted to use such objects, and those objects cannot be used whatsoever. I think you've seen a case where there's a town that becomes infested with idol worship. You have to burn all the property with it. So what generally happens, the question there is not whether or not they get the death penalty to the person who's practiced it, but why is there monetary liability simultaneously? This is what I mean. If somebody's going to be subject to the death penalty, generally the financial liability aspect, the compensation is waived because there's kimle b'di rabba minay, which means if you create a capital offense simultaneously when you incur a monetary payment, you're not subject to the monetary liability. So, for example, if somebody breaks Shabbos with 2 witnesses and warnings, and in that breaking of Shabbos, they burn somebody's Picasso. Now, because they've broken Shabbat, they're subject to the death penalty after the warnings, etc. But at the same time, they broke the Shabbat with the fire that burnt the Picasso on somebody's wall. So then they don't have to pay for the Picasso because they're getting the death penalty. So the higher, more stringent payment supersedes the lower payment. So, for example, if you've got 2 death penalties, you've got a more stringent death penalty and a lighter one. The lighter one gets waived for the more stringent, so you can have a full kapora. So that's the concept of kimle b'di rabba minay. Are you with me? So the question... Sorry. Michael? No. What were you saying, Michael?
Lost his Picasso, doesn't get paid.
He doesn't get paid. Anyway, what should turn up is a person's going to get the death penalty.
So he should forget about his money. Yeah.
but he's not, I know, but I mean, I get you. It doesn't cheer him up that much. But that's what insurance is for. So he doesn't get paid. That's correct. So so what Rashi wants is bringing forward here is this is the chiddush. Why is he paying the financial penalty here when he's subject to the death penalty as part of the libation to idolatry?
Just give us that example. Sorry, I didn't hear the example so well. What actually happened? The guy was practicing
nesech damage is damage where your property is rendered unusable by Jews because it's part of idol worship practice. So in other words, if it's used in a ritual or it's used to do with idol worship, your particular property that's used within that cannot be used by any other Jewish person. Are you with me?
No, so you can't derive any benefit.
You can't derive any benefit. I'm going to tell you how it's going to affect it because you're saying, but he's not using his property. So we're not saying with the guy that has his own bottle of wine, for example, that uses it in his idol worship practice. What we're saying is he took his neighbor Shevis Regal because he thought the idol deserved the best. So he took his neighbor Shevis Regal and he was about to do the ritual libation for the liquid, to pour it on the altar. And he has to now, say, for example, he didn't pour out that wine, or he did pour out that wine. Say he was stopped beforehand. You still can't use that Chivas Regal whiskey or wine, or whatever it is. You get what I'm saying? Whether or not it was poured down the drain, it would have to be replaced, or even if that bottle was set aside for it and nothing happened, you can't use something that was set aside for idol worship. It is rendered forbidden.
Okay, I want to ask you something. Okay, I am familiar with the concept that idol worshipping is the death penalty, and it's a very, very serious offense. However, right throughout Jewish history, we've had a lot of Jews who have been from and tzaddikim in theory and Talmudim Chachamim, giants, who have also practiced idolatry at the same time, because they say that the Yetzer Hara for idolatry was so huge at that time that any of us would have practiced idolatry as well. It's not as simple. There's that famous story of that guy who had a dream, and he was told that it was very, very difficult, and the Yetzer Hara took control of you. But I don't recall those guys being given the death penalty. So it seems like you were allowed to continue with idol worshipping and believing in Hashem without getting the death penalty. I'm just saying.
God forbid. And the proof of it is that 400 Jews were killed. There were 400 Jews. I'm not sure if they were Kohanim. I think they might have been even, that were involved. The death penalty, again, like any other death penalty, needs warning and witnesses. And it's a very, very difficult thing, especially if multiple people are involved, to get you to testify against your brother, especially if it seems to be a spiritual malady that's going around. So it's very difficult.
Remember all those kings? Remember all those kings we learned? There was a whole bunch of them that we learned that set up idols. They blocked the route from where they were all the way to Jerusalem, and they put Baal idols up and everything like that. And those kings never got the death penalty in this world.
So what you've got to bear in mind is that you first had to make sure a king was removed from the throne. A king obviously had certain special protection and powers. Secondly, there's a difference between setting it up and bowing down to it. In Sanhedrin, it says, Kadaika and Shalor Kadaika, there's a normal way to serve an idol. You weren't there for the first two books. And a normal way. So I just want to get back to damages, but let me just address this, that in those times, they specifically gave the death penalty if there was warnings and witnesses, because it was so prolific. And it was never allowed to serve that in connection with God. One of the questions is, for non-Jewish nations, are they allowed to have an intermediary or not if they acknowledge Hashem? That is a philosophical issue. And it turns out that, by the way, one of the 7 Noahide laws, idolatry is forbidden by the non-Jews as well. So, Kal V'chomer, of course, it's forbidden by Jews, even then. Even, okay. It doesn't matter. Today, people have an addiction for sex. If you commit adultery, it's still adultery.
I understand, but it just seems that people weren't punished as much.
Because it's not the scope of Bava Kamma.
All right, but it is... Okay, all right. We'll talk later. All right, let's go. Let's move forward. Thanks.
Leviticus chapter 24, verse 21. One who strikes an animal shall pay for it. So that is to do with avos that are included in the general verse of the property that damages another. So that is why this is prohibited. You've taken someone else's goods and you've rendered it useless to Jewish people. Either the value has reduced because it can only be used by the Kohen, or the value is reduced because no Jewish person can use it at all. Those are the 3 examples that are given. Does that make sense in terms of the derivative of where it's found? Yep. Okay, so accordingly, what we're saying is it's going to go to a case that why why does Rav Oshen not discuss the last three? Because it seems that is compensation. In other words, if I take your bottle of wine and put tumah into it, or I put teruma that only a Kohen can have it and I can fetch lower money for the wine, or it's rendered nesech, in that particular case, I can't use it. So it's the equivalent of damaging property, which means it's a compensation. You're just replacing it. So why is it considered a penalty? And that is going to be discussed. I was busy talking about Kiv Lebedi Rabba Mineh. And what that basically, what Rashi came to bring in Gittin 52b, is that the reason he's subject to the money payment is there's two different sorts of prohibitions. The one is idol worship, of which a wine libation was part of it, and the other one was lifting up the jug of wine. So if you lift up the jug of wine and you haven't poured it yet, okay, and the person hasn't committed the idol worship yet, A, they don't get the death penalty at that stage because they haven't gone through with it. They're about to, but you still can't use that wine. And B, if they do it and get the death penalty, because the act of lifting up is not part of the service itself, the actual service, you still have to pay the monetary payment. The reason you can't use it is obviously it's a pre-step to the idol worship. But because it's not the idol worship itself, there's monetary compensation. It doesn't fall away. It's not part of the idolatry practice. Does that make sense, guys?
Yep.
Fine. So what we're going to do now is we're going to discuss a little bit just now on the Gemara, why something where you're damaging the produce, which is compensation where you have to repay it back. Why is that not discussed by Rav Ashaya? Okay, because that is a question. But that we're going to deal with later. We're now finally on 4b4. I thought we would never get here, to be honest. Okay, just give me a sec.
No rush.
Fine. All right. Now, we're coming back to the issue of a robber, by the way. Do you remember there wasn't a clear issue? Because we said that a robber pays back exactly what he held somebody up at knife point to take. So therefore, it says there seems to be a problem. They weren't that happy with it in the Gemara because they said, well, if he's paying back exactly what he owes, then that indeed is compensation, which is a good question. So then they want to say that on the same token, they're not happy with the word thief, because a thief, for example, by his own volition that came to confess before he made an oath, has to just pay back compensation, okay? Or if he was convicted but goes to a new court and runs away before they can catch him, just say he runs out on the bailiff and he goes to a new court and says, listen, this is what I did, they convicted me. He's then again by his own admission. So he doesn't have to pay the penalty factor, just the actual compensatory nature. So what they're saying by Rav Ashaya is, why didn't you mention this in the list by Rav Chia? Good question, guys. What do you think from the Gemara?
Very good question.
Yeah, good question.
But all these issues can lead to penalties as well. Maybe that's why.
No. So generally, it's a good question, Gavin. When there is a penalty, Cranberry, that's my surfboard. When there is any sort of penalty, what happened is the penalty is mentioned first, and then the compensatory nature, like for agricultural damage, where there's a fourfold and fivefold payment, with the first one being compensatory in nature, which is the principal, plus times 3 for a sheep and times 4 penalty for the ox. And in that case, because you're paying back more, then you incurred them in terms of a loss. Even though there's a compensatory part of it, it goes under the other penalty because the amount you're paying is actually more. It's only in a case by a thief's own admission that he only has to pay the principal amount, which is the compensation, as well as a a robber in all circumstances. So it says, why don't you mention these two particular cases? Okay, so this is what we're going to go through now. And in fact, Rav Ashaya says, I have. And let me just tell you where he does mention it as a matter of interest. So what happens is, if you think about this, do you remember he discusses the case of a paid custodian?
Yeah.
Okay, now a paid custodian, well, let's take a look at a borrower. Hello. Yeah, well, let's take a case of a borrower. A borrower is subject to the highest amount of responsibility because the guy's doing him a favor. With a paid custodian, the guy's also held to a high responsibility, but not as high, because he's getting paid to look after stuff, right? And there he's responsible for negligence, theft, or stolen. Remember that. So if an object is lost or stolen and negligence, he's responsible. So therefore, Rav Ashaya does mention it there, because therefore what happens is, if the borrower says that it's stolen, he has to pay it back anyway. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's what Rashba and Rashi says. He's not considered a thief. Why? Because if he claims that it got stolen, he has to replace it. So therefore, it's mentioned there. The issue of a thief is mentioned in terms of compensation, because Rav Ashaya only discusses compensation. So in a case where it's pure compensation, where he either admits to taking the article for himself because he's about to go under oath and he doesn't want to say a false oath in Hashem's name, or the fact that he's not prepared to take an oath, his responsibility is that he still has to replace that financial value. And since he's replacing that financial value exactly, he's not a thief in the sense that he has to pay a penalty. He's compensating. And therefore, Rav Ashaya mentions that. Fine. If you have a look then at a robber, it's mentioned under the same grounds. Why? Because if I've given you the article and you say to me, somebody robbed your car at gunpoint by me in a hijacking. Again, Rav Osher mentions that because all you have to do is pay back what you claim to have happened. Okay? Because you're assuming that responsibility. The only issue is an unpaid custodian. That's actually the issue that we're coming to now. Because an unpaid custodian, you're doing the guy a favor. So you only have to pay for negligence. Does that make sense? So that's the only time that there's a bit of a question here. So in the case of an unpaid custodian, although the custodian is presently, how do I put it? I'm just trying to put it in the easiest way. He would have to also take an oath. And many times, if a person was going to take an oath in Hashem's name, they would basically crack. So they had a chance under their own admission to say that they took it, and then they're just paying under their own admission the actual compensation and no penalty. Therefore, Rav Ashaya mentioned it even in the case of the unpaid custodian. Now, if I was an unpaid custodian, I would never say I got it stolen from me. I would say somebody robbed me. Why? Because if I was caught, then what do I have to pay back? The lower amount. I don't have to pay any penalty for theft. I just have to pay back what I attempted was robbed from me. Do you see what I'm saying? So guys, say you wanted to make a false claim as an unpaid custodian. So as an unpaid custodian, you're not really subject to paying back anything other than negligence. So you would say, it's better that I claimed it was robbed from me, so that if there were witnesses that I didn't see, I would only have to pay back the principal amount for compensation. I don't have to pay the double penalty for theft. And if it's an agricultural item of a sheep, I don't have to pay a threefold penalty, which is threefold plus the principal, which is 4 times the value. And with the ox, it's 4 times the penalty and one compensatory amount, which is 5 times in total that you pay. So the best thing to claim if you're an unpaid custodian is robbery. Why? because you're only then entitled to pay what you stole if evidence comes against you. So Rav Ashaya lists it. Does that make sense, guys? Nobody's going to come to claim something that's going to cost them more. Let me just finish. We've got 10 minutes left before there's any questions.
I just want to add to that just 1 second, Damon. That robbery example, which is a great loophole, why can't it be used by the paid custodian, by the borrower, all of them? They can all use it.
It can, but whether or not it's considered theft, whether or not it was stolen from you or you were robbed, because they've got a higher degree of responsibility, they have to pay it back anyway. It's part of their responsibility. Because a borrower...
but they're limited. They don't get any penalties if
you're not hearing me. No, you're not hearing me. What I'm saying is somebody that's paid to do the job, whether they claim it was robbed or stolen, they're not considered a thief because they automatically have to replace that item value. There's no trial. They have to pay it back by law.
Okay,
they accept a higher responsibility. Robbery. Yes, because a borrower, you're doing him a favor. So he's saying, listen, I'm going to be responsible no matter what happens, even if it's hit by lightning. And with the paid custodian, I'm responsible no matter what happens, except if it's hit by lightning or something odd. And then I have to make a shavua oath. And if it's rendered inverted commas lost, it means useless, meaning not working, unless it's an act of God. You get what I'm saying? And even so in that case, they have to pay back anyway. There's no trial. They just have to automatically replace it. So just one thing that I needed to end off the Gemara on is that Rav Chia taught separately cases of money that came into the damager's hand permissibly and illegally. What do you mean permissibly? Is that the person that lent him the article, either as a borrower or said to him, look after my stuff, I'm either going to pay you to look after my stuff or you're doing me a favor. He gave it to him legally. It was after this that the drama unfolded. It's like you pay a deposit for goods and the person absconds with your deposit. The transaction was legal, but the person stole within that transactionary stage. So what happens here is Rav Chia separates the case of money that came into the damager's hand permissibly, of which Rav Ashaya talks about, and a case where it's came into his hand illegally, that there was an actual robbery and an actual theft. And Rav Ashaya said whether or not it came into his hand legally or illegally, we've already covered theft and robbery in my list. So that issue has been cleared. Any questions, guys?
No, I'm cool.
No, I'm cool.
All right. I know Kevin has to go. So stealing and robbing differ fundamentally if you get permission or not, but either way, Rav Ashaya covers it, and that's in 4B4. So good. We did good. I hope you guys have a good Shabbos.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Ciao.
Ciao, bye.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks.